The banquet hall reeked of death. The torches still burned, but their flames seemed dim, as though they too were mourning what had unfolded. Wine soaked the marble, mixing with blood into a dark, sticky river that crawled down the steps of the dais. Chairs lay overturned, plates shattered, jewels scattered like the broken pride of the court. The music was gone. The laughter was gone. Only the crackle of fire and the ragged sobs of the queen filled the silence. She clutched her knight's lifeless body, her gown torn, her diamonds dulled with blood. Her cries were not for her husband, not for her sons, but for the lover who had died choking at her feet. The crown itself lay abandoned beside the master's corpse, its gold stained with wine, its emeralds dulled by torchlight. The guards arrived late, stumbling through the doors, their swords drawn too slowly, their eyes widening at the carnage before them. They froze, unsure whether to bow, to fight, or to flee. Before them stood the dwarf, his dagger still wet, his small frame silhouetted by the throne behind him. Not a word left his lips. He did not raise his weapon. He simply stared at them, his silence heavier than any command. Some guards dropped their blades, backing away, their courage drained at the sight of the massacre. Others, trembling, lifted their swords only to find their legs unwilling to move. The dwarf did not chase them, did not speak, did not kill again. He turned his gaze back to the throne, as if daring anyone to claim it. None did. Beyond the hall, whispers spread like wildfire. Servants carried the story through corridors, out to the courtyards, into the city streets. The tale twisted as it traveled. Some said the dwarf had poisoned every goblet in the hall, others that he had struck down the master with a single blow. Some called it the work of dark gods, others the vengeance of the forgotten. By midnight, the city was alive with rumor, fear crackling in every alley. The common folk, long crushed under the master's rule, felt a tremor of hope. They whispered in taverns, "The tyrant is dead." Farmers told each other in hushed voices. A servant rose and struck him down. Mothers rocked their children to sleep with tales of a shadow that humbled kings. But hope is a dangerous flame. With no heir fit to rule, no ministers left to guide, no queen strong enough to lead, chaos loomed over the kingdom like a storm waiting to break. In the palace, the silence thickened. The queen retreated to her chambers, her face hollow, her eyes red from weeping. The crown lay unclaimed, its power now poisoned, its promise shattered. Ministers who might have schemed for it lay cold on the banquet floor. Princes who might have inherited it choked on their last breaths before servants dragged their corpses away. The throne stood empty, as if cursed, daring no one to sit upon it. The dwarf, when the night had ended, did not vanish. He walked slowly from the hall, dagger in hand, his steps steady, his head unbowed. The servants scattered before him, not out of hatred, not even out of fear, but out of awe. No one dared touch him. No one dared speak his name aloud. He passed through the gates into the cold night air, leaving behind the ruins of a kingdom broken from within. Outside, the city was waking to the truth. Bells tolled in confusion. Messengers ran through the streets. Soldiers rushed to the palace only to find their leaders dead. Some cried that rebellion was at hand. Others feared foreign armies would seize the chance to invade. But amid the panic, one truth rang louder than all. The king was dead, not by sword or army, but by the hand of a servant no one had ever seen. And so the palace stood, silent and hollow, a monument of stone now stained with betrayal. The feast that was meant to celebrate power had destroyed it. The kingdom trembled on the edge of collapse, unsure whether to rejoice or to mourn. In the days that followed, the great hall was sealed, its doors chained, its torches extinguished. No priest dared to cleanse it, no servant dared to sweep it, no soldier dared to guard it. The hall became a tomb, and in its silence the legend of that night grew. But for those who had witnessed it, the guards who froze, the servants who fled, the queen who screamed, silence was not enough. They carried the memory in their eyes, the weight in their hearts. They would speak of it in whispers, in prayers, in nightmares. The dwarf was gone. The master was gone. The court was gone. What remained was only silence, heavy, unbroken, eternal. They say kingdoms fall in thunder, in fire, in war, but this one fell in whispers. In taverns lit by weak candles, the story grew with each telling. The drunk spoke of a dwarf who poisoned 1,000 goblets with a single drop. The fearful swore he had called demons into the feast. shadows that danced and clawed, until every noble was dragged screaming into the dark. Some claimed he never touched a blade at all, that the master's heart burst from terror when he looked into his servant's eyes. No two tales matched, but all carried the same truth. The king was dead, and it was no army that felled him. It was the smallest, the most mocked, the one who had bowed the lowest. Minstrels took the tale to the marketplaces. Their songs turned blood into poetry, pain into rhyme. Lutes strummed the rhythm of betrayal. Flutes wept the sorrow of servants. Children huddled at their mothers' feet as the singers warned them, "Beware the forgotten, for they see all, they hear all, and one day they rise." And in the smoky corners of gambling dens the tone shifted. Men whispered not of sorrow but of warning. "Trust no servant," they muttered. "Even a fool may wear a mask sharper than a blade." Lords began locking their wine, tasting their food before daring to drink, eyeing their servants with suspicion. The tale had become not just myth but paranoia. The queen, broken and hollow, locked herself away. Yet even in silence her name became part of the tale. Some claimed she had known of the plot, that she and her knight had conspired to rid themselves of the master, only to be swallowed by the poison meant for others. Others said she cursed the dwarf with her last scream, damning him to wander the earth forever, crownless, homeless, nameless. Years passed, and the story did not fade. It grew. The dwarf became more than a man. To some he was an angel of vengeance sent to punish tyrants. To others he was a demon, proof that the lowly should never be trusted. Merchants carved little wooden figures of him, dagger in hand, selling them as charms against betrayal. Priests wove him into sermons. The gods strike through the smallest hand. In battlefields, soldiers whispered of him before charging. "Be like the dwarf," they muttered. "Strike where it hurts most. Kill the master, and the army falls." His legend became strategy, a weapon sharper than steel. But among the peasants, the story softened. Mothers told their children not just of blood, but of justice. Even the smallest heart can carry great courage, they said. Even the weakest hand can topple a tyrant. In their mouths, he was not a murderer, but a hero. The dwarf became a symbol of hope, proof that no chain lasts forever. No master is untouchable. And yet the mystery deepened. Where had he gone after that night? Some claimed he walked into the mountains, vanishing into caves where no man dared follow. Others swore they had seen him in distant lands dressed as a pilgrim, wandering with eyes haunted but unbroken. A few whispered darker tales, that he never left the palace at all, that he roamed its halls as a ghost, dagger in hand, waiting for another tyrant to sit upon the throne. Generations turned. Kings rose and fell, wars burned and faded. Still the story lived. Poets inked it in scrolls. Bards sang it by firelight. Painters etched it onto canvas. The dwarf was no longer a servant, no longer even a man. He was legend, myth, warning, and prayer. And in every telling, one image remained unchanged. A marble floor stained with wine and blood. A crown rolling from the hand of a dying master. And a figure small in frame but vast in shadow, standing alone, dagger dripping, eyes burning with vengeance. So when the bells toll in the dead of night, and the wine tastes bitter, and the laughter in the hall feels too loud, men still shiver and glance at their servants, wondering if the tale is more than memory. Wondering if somewhere the dwarf still walks. And so the dwarf became more than flesh and blood. He became a whisper, a shadow in the corner of every throne room, a warning carved into history. Even the smallest hand can end the mightiest reign. So I'll leave you with this. If betrayal brewed in your halls, would you see it coming? Or would you drink from the poisoned cup? Subscribe. Stay close. The next tale waits in the dark. The night chosen for the reckoning was dressed in gold. Torches lit the great hall like a burning forest, their flames dancing across pillars carved with kings of old. The long tables stretched endlessly, covered in silver plates, roasted meats, towers of fruit, and barrels of wine so rich its scent alone could intoxicate. Nobles gathered in silks and jewels, ministers whispered with swollen pride, courtiers strutted like peacocks, and the queen herself glittered with diamonds heavy enough to break a neck. Laughter filled the air, thick and smug, drowning out the cries of peasants outside the gates. The dwarf moved among them as he always had, small, invisible, the shadow of a shadow. He bowed, he smiled. He poured wine into goblets that would soon be filled not only with drink but with death. Every step was measured, every motion rehearsed, the performance of a servant hiding the precision of an executioner. The master sat at the head of the table, bloated with wine, crowned with arrogance. His goblet was larger than the rest, carved from gold, studded with emeralds. He laughed louder than all others, his voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. A voice that once commanded armies, now roaring only to humiliate. He raised his cup and the hall cheered. The dwarf had chosen this night well. It was a celebration of victory, an old battle won long ago but remembered yearly with feasts and songs. Every noble, every minister, every rival, every prince was present. Even the queen's secret knight lingered at her side, pretending loyalty to the crown he secretly despised. It was the one night when suspicion slept. The wine flowed too freely, the food too heavily, the guards too drunk on stolen meat to watch carefully. The dwarf poured. A drop here, a trickle there, powders crushed so fine they vanished in the wine. Oils clear as water, slipping unnoticed into goblets. He had chosen his poisons with care. Some would burn the throat, some would stop the heart, some would gnaw the stomach from within. He did not want silence. He wanted screams. He wanted chaos. He wanted the palace to choke on its own laughter. The music played. Dancers spun across the floor, silk ribbons swirling in torchlight. Courtiers toasted, slamming their cups together, spilling droplets onto the marble. Ministers whispered of new schemes even as death swirled in their drinks. The queen leaned toward her lover, her jeweled hand brushing his, unaware of the doom resting in the chalice between them. The princes, already flushed with drink, mocked the servants, threw bones across the floor, laughed at their own cruelty. And the master, drunk on pride, demanded his jester, his dwarf, his beast, to entertain once again. The dwarf stepped into the center of the hall, his face calm, his body steady, though his heart pounded like a war drum. He bowed low. He raised his voice, and he sang. It was not the merry song of a fool, not the playful jest of a clown. It was a dark melody, heavy and haunting. The kind of song that made the torches flicker and the guests shift uneasily in their seats. A ballad of betrayal, of kings brought low, of palaces burning. The words slipped like knives into the hall, but the master, too drunk to hear the warning, laughed and clapped. Sing louder, little beast. Let them hear how loyal you are. The dwarf sang louder, and as his voice rose, goblets lifted. Wine touched lips. Death began its slow crawl down noble throats. It started as a cough, a minister choking on a laugh, pounding his chest as though the meat had caught wrong. Then another, clutching his stomach, his eyes wide, his goblet slipping from his hand. Then another, his lips frothing, his body convulsing against the table. One by one, the laughter turned to screams. Chairs toppled, plates crashed to the floor. Torches shook as guests staggered, their faces pale, their bodies writhing. The queen gasped, her goblet slipping from her hand. Her lover reached for her, but his own throat tightened, his body stiffened. His eyes rolled back as foam bubbled from his mouth. He collapsed at her feet, his hand still clawing for hers. She screamed, a sound that pierced the chaos, but no one came to her aid. The princes fared no better. One collapsed face first into the roasted boar, his blood mixing with grease. Another clawed at his neck, his laughter dying in a gurgle as he fell from his chair, thrashing on the floor like a fish torn from water. Servants screamed and fled, their trays crashing, their feet slipping in spilled wine that now smelled of death. And still the master laughed. At first he thought it a jest, a trick, some cruel irony of the gods. He roared with laughter as his ministers fell, as his courtiers collapsed, as his own sons writhed like insects on the marble. "Look at them!" He shouted. "Weak! Worthless! This is what loyalty brings." He lifted his goblet high, blind to the truth that he drank poison with every sip. The dwarf stepped closer. His song faded, his lips twisted into something colder than a smile. He moved with calm, deliberate steps across the chaos, through bodies convulsing on the floor, through nobles choking on their last breaths. He walked to the throne. The master finally saw him. His laughter faltered. His hand shook. He looked down at his goblet, at the foam beginning to gather at the edge of his lips. His eyes widened. For the first time in his reign, fear touched his face. "You," he whispered. The dwarf did not answer. He climbed the steps of the dais slowly, each one heavy as thunder. The master tried to rise, but his body betrayed him, his limbs weak, his breath ragged. He reached for the dagger at his belt, but his fingers slipped, useless. The dwarf reached the throne. He stood before the man who had mocked him, beaten him, humiliated him before crowds. He looked into his eyes, not with rage, not with pity, but with the cold gaze of justice long denied. He raised his dagger. The hall was filled with screams, choking, gurgling cries, the stench of death. But in that moment, silence fell between master and servant. The dwarf pressed the blade to his chest and whispered, "This is for every drop of blood you spilled." And he drove it deep. The master gasped, his body jolting as the steel pierced his heart. His goblet fell, spilling the last of the poisoned wine across the dais. His eyes, once blazing with arrogance, dimmed to emptiness. He slumped forward, his crown sliding from his head, clattering down the steps, rolling across the marble floor. The dwarf stood over the corpse, the dagger dripping red, his chest heaving with calm breaths. Around him, the palace had become a tomb. Ministers, princes, courtiers, lovers, dead or dying, their laughter silenced forever. The queen sobbed against the body of her knight, her jewels shattered, her mask of beauty broken. The dwarf lifted the crown from the floor. For a moment, he held it in his hands, heavy with the weight of every crime it represented. He stared at it, then dropped it beside the master's corpse. He had no desire for the throne. His vengeance was not to rule, but to destroy. Silence fell. The music was gone. The laughter was gone. Only the crackle of torches remained, flickering over marble floors stained with wine and blood. The storm had passed. The reckoning was complete. The palace was broken, not by armies, not by rebellion, but by the smallest shadow it had once mocked. And the dwarf stood alone among the ruins, a kingmaker, a kingslayer, and the ghost of a vengeance fulfilled. The vow once sworn became a weight he carried with every breath. The palace still laughed. The princes still mocked. The queen still smirked behind jeweled fingers. But something inside the dwarf had changed. He no longer heard the laughter as wounds, it was fuel. Each insult was no longer pain, but a reminder of the fire he had lit within himself. He began to plan. At first, it was only whispers in his mind, fantasies of daggers sliding across throats, of goblets turning black with poison. But thoughts grew into patterns, patterns into steps, and soon, every day became a rehearsal for the moment to come. He knew the palace better than any map. He knew which corridors stayed dark after sunset, which doors creaked and which stayed silent, which guards drank more than they watched. He knew the master's habits, the feasts where he drank until his laughter turned to coughing, the nights where he wandered alone to his chamber with his lovers, the mornings when he demanded songs to cure his headaches. Every detail became a weapon. The dwarf turned to the kitchens first. The cooks trusted him. He carried trays, fetched wine, scrubbed their pans when no other servant would. From them he learned the nature of powders and herbs. He watched the old women crush seeds to calm fevers, steep roots that dulled pain, grind leaves that made men sleep so deeply they sometimes did not wake. He asked questions softly, his voice curious, harmless. He listened and he remembered. Slowly he gathered pieces, crumbs of knowledge no one thought dangerous in his hands. Then came the market. With coins stolen from the drunken pockets of princes, he slipped through the back gates on errands and found the stalls of apothecaries and beggars. There were powders sold in clay jars, bitter seeds wrapped in cloth, oils that glimmered like black water. One crippled man, his face half hidden in rags, sold him a vial the size of a finger. "A drop in wine," the man whispered, "and your enemy will bleed inside without a blade." The dwarf bought it, and many more like it, tucking them away in cracks of stone in his hidden corner of the palace. But poison alone was not enough. The king was gluttonous but not careless. Food tasters licked his plates before he ate. Guards drank from his goblet before he touched it. The dwarf knew this. If he struck, it had to be not only swift but merciless. A storm that killed many at once so no one could save the master. A single death could be hidden, denied, explained away. But a massacre would leave no doubt. He needed allies, though he trusted no one. Still, There were cracks in the palace walls, cracks he could slip into. The scullery boys who hated the princes, beaten for every mistake. The guards who resented their commanders, forced to stand in the cold while nobles feasted. The maids who whispered of abuse in candlelight, their eyes heavy with hatred. He listened to them, gave them comfort, earned their trust. He promised nothing, revealed nothing. But when the time came, he would know which ones could be nudged, which ones could look the other way. And then there were the shadows beyond the gates. He ventured deeper into the city at night, when the guards thought him running errands. There he met thieves in taverns, mercenaries with scarred hands, beggars who saw more than they should. He bought their silence with coins and sometimes with secrets of the court. They laughed at him, a dwarf speaking of daggers and kings, but he endured their mockery. In the end, a coin was still a coin, and men would kill for less. The dwarf practiced alone. In the darkness of his quarters, he sharpened blades stolen from the kitchens, practiced slipping them into sleeves, hiding them in boots. He learned to move in silence, to breathe slowly, to watch for the rhythm of footsteps and strike between them. He cut his own palm once, watching the blood drip, whispering to himself, "Better mine now than his later." But it was not just steel and poison that shaped his plan. It was ritual. On the night of a new moon, he drew a circle on the stone floor with chalk and salt stolen from the kitchens. Inside it, he placed the symbols of his hate: a broken cup, piece of glass from the night he bled for the king's amusement, a strip of cloth torn from a prince's robe, and the vial of poison that shimmered like death itself. He lit a candle and whispered his vow again, louder than before. Not to gods, not to spirits, but to himself. "I am no man's beast. I am no man's fool. I am the storm they made, and I will bring it down upon them." The flame wavered, but did not die. Time became his ally. He did not rush. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. He served as always, smiling, bowing, fetching, listening. To the court, he was the same harmless shadow. But in secret, he rehearsed their end. He mapped every seat in the banquet hall, every path the wine would take from barrel to goblet, every servant who touched the food before it reached the table. He memorized the master's feasting days, the anniversaries and victories he celebrated with wine-soaked laughter. He marked the one night where the hall would be fullest, where the goblets would be many, where suspicion would be least, because no one suspects poison when everyone drinks. His heart grew colder. Where once he had been a boy longing for kindness, he was now a man sharpening hate into purpose. Where once he dreamed of escape, now he dreamed only of destruction. He no longer wished to flee the palace. He wished to bury it in silence. Every laugh he endured became the ticking of a clock. Every order he obeyed was one step closer to the night when he would no longer bow. He tasted the future in his thoughts. A night where the hall would echo not with laughter, but with choking cries. Not with music, but with screams. Not with life, but with silence. The dwarf had been made into a servant. But in his secret hours, with his poisons and his blades, he remade himself into an executioner. The court believed him harmless. They believed his smile. They believed his chains of mockery were unbreakable. But they had forgotten the truth he whispered to himself with every breath. The smallest shadow can bring down the tallest throne. The night of his breaking came not with thunder, but with laughter. The grand hall blazed with torches, its walls echoing with music and the clatter of goblets. Foreign envoys had arrived from distant lands, and the king wished to display his power. But power for him was never gold alone. It was humiliation carefully staged for others to see, and the dwarf was always his favorite tool. He was summoned in chains of mockery, not iron. The king, already drunk, slapped the table and roared, "Bring me my little beast. Let him dance. Let him show these guests the might of our kingdom." The hall erupted in cheers, nobles pounding their goblets. The dwarf stepped forward, his face painted with a smile he did not feel. His stomach coiled with rage, but his body bowed as commanded. They placed a drum beside him and ordered him to sing. His voice carried through the chamber, soft at first, then rising, a song of sorrow disguised as jest. Some envoys wept at the melody, but the king laughed louder. "Do you see?" he shouted. "Even our monsters sing for their masters." The humiliation deepened. One prince, bloated with wine, hurled bones at his feet, commanding him to crawl and fetch them like a dog. Another forced a cup into his hand, making him drink until he choked, his lips stained with bitter wine. The queen, seated beside her husband, covered her laughter with jeweled fingers, her eyes glimmering with cruel delight. The courtiers howled, their applause striking like whips against his back. And then came the final blow. The king demanded a jest about loyalty. The dwarf hesitated, his lips tightening. But hesitation was death in those halls. He forced a crooked smile and muttered a line, sharp enough to sting, not sharp enough to wound. The court erupted in laughter. All but the king. The master's face turned red with fury. He stood towering over the small figure at his feet. "Is this mockery?" he roared. "Do you bite the hand that feeds you?" Before the dwarf could answer, the king struck him across the face with the golden goblet. Wine and blood spilled together on the marble floor. The hall fell silent for a breath. Then the laughter rose again, sharper, crueler, like knives in the dark. The dwarf fell to his knees. His vision blurred, his body trembled, not with fear but with something darker. In that silence inside his skull, he heard his own heart whisper, "Enough." They thought him broken. They thought the blow had silenced him. But inside the fire burned brighter than ever. Each insult, each lash, each wound had been a spark. Now they merged into flame. He lifted his head slowly, his face a mask of obedience. He forced the corners of his lips to bend into a smile. He bowed low, blood dripping from his chin. The king turned away, satisfied with his dominance, and the court returned to its laughter. But in that bow, in that silence, the dwarf swore an oath so sharp it cut through his very bones. That night, in the solitude of his chamber, he stared at the scars across his hands, at the blood still staining his skin. He whispered into the darkness, not as a jester, not as a servant, but as a man reborn. No more. The palace had mocked him. The queen had spat upon him. The princes had treated him as less than an animal. And the master, the man he once obeyed without question, had shown the world he was nothing but a beast for amusement. They believed the chains of mockery could bind him forever. They were wrong. As the torches in the courtyard flickered, he pressed his palm against the cold stone wall and swore the vow aloud, his voice shaking but fierce. One day the laughter would end. One day the goblets would fall silent. One day, blood would spill on marble floors, and it would not be his. That was the night the servant died and the shadow of vengeance was born. The torchlight flickered. Shadows danced on stone. A body lay sprawled across the marble floor, still, breathless. His master, once feared, now nothing, and over him, stood the dwarf. Small in frame, yet heavy with rage. His dagger dripped red, drop by drop. The silence was louder than any scream. No guards rushed in. No ministers whispered. The palace froze in horror. His eyes, dark, burning, never blinked. No laughter of a jester. No trembling servant's bow. Only vengeance, cold, precise, final. What drives a man so small? To commit a murder so great? Was it years of chains, mockery, and scars, or a secret darker than the crown itself? That night, loyalty bled on marble floors. The night a king fell not by armies, but by the hands of one he trusted most. And the question remains, if you were him, humiliated, broken, betrayed, would you kill your master too? The palace rose like a fortress of dreams, wrapped in golden walls and iron gates. To the people outside, it was the heart of glory. Inside, it was a nest of poison. The dwarf was born not far from those gilded gates. His mother died giving him life. His father, ashamed of the child's small frame, abandoned him to the mercy of fate. For years, he was tossed from one cruel hand to another, mocked in the streets, beaten by drunkards, forced to dance for coins he never kept. Fate, however, carried him into the palace. A nobleman, amused by the child's sharp tongue and quick wit, presented him as a gift to the king, and so began his life as both ornament and shadow. By day, he performed tricks and songs for the royal court. By night, he fetched wine, polished boots, and listened. Always listening. In those grand halls, laughter was never pure. Every smile hid a dagger. He became invisible and useful, two qualities that ensured survival. The king, his master, treated him like an exotic animal. He would toss scraps of meat at his feet during banquets. He would call him my little monster before crowds of laughing nobles. He would command him to crawl, bark, or drink until he collapsed. Each humiliation burned itself into the dwarf's heart like a brand. Yet behind those dark eyes, a cunning mind grew sharper. He watched ministers argue over land and gold. He heard the queen whisper to her lovers in candlelit chambers. He saw princes fighting over women and jewels while peasants starved beyond the gates. The palace was a golden cage, beautiful outside, rotten within. Symbols marked his memory. The crown, heavy and jeweled, passed from hand to hand yet never truly belonging to the people. The dagger, polished and blood-stained, always ready to silence dissent. The chalice filled with wine, often laced with powders that brought sleep or death. He learned early that the court was not ruled by honor, but by fear. A servant's whisper could topple a minister. A mistress's tears could start a war, and a single jest from him, spoken at the wrong moment, could earn a beating that left scars across his back. Still, he endured. Because endurance was his weapon. Every insult, every lash, every mockery carved his will deeper, like steel hammered in fire. One night, when the king forced him to dance on broken glass for the amusement of foreign guests, he bled until his feet were nothing but torn flesh. The hall roared with laughter. The dwarf bowed, blood dripping, a smile painted across his lips. But in his chest he swore an oath. One day I will make you bleed as I bleed tonight. Years passed. The dwarf grew into a man, small, crooked in body, but unbroken in spirit. He became the keeper of secrets. Ministers bribed him to deliver letters. Guards trusted him to carry messages. Queens whispered in his ear, thinking him harmless. He collected every word, storing them like daggers in the dark, and always there was the master. The king bloated with wine and arrogance, who believed no hand could touch him. He wore the crown as if it were his birthright, crushing anyone who dared to rise against him. But in his blindness, he failed to see the storm building in the smallest corner of his palace. The dwarf no longer feared him. He studied his habits, the way he drank deeply, the nights he wandered the halls alone, the lovers he brought to his chambers. He knew the rhythm of his life better than any guard or minister. He knew his weaknesses, and with every lash of cruelty, the seed of hatred grew into a tree with poisoned roots. The palace, for all its splendor, became a theater of betrayal. Lovers poisoned one another. Ministers sent assassins into the night. Princes plotted against brothers. The dwarf watched it all, silent and smiling. Because he knew his turn would come. The master believed himself untouchable, but he forgot one truth. Those who are closest, who serve your food, who pour your wine, who clean your chambers, hold the power to destroy you. And the dwarf, the forgotten shadow in the golden palace, carried that truth like a dagger pressed to his own heart, waiting for the day he could plunge it into another. The story of his childhood was not one of mercy. It was one of survival. The story of his service was not one of loyalty. It was one of chains. And the story of his hate was not one of madness. It was one of justice. The palace had made him a slave, but the palace had also made him a weapon. The palace breathed treachery. Behind its jeweled doors and velvet curtains, every smile was a mask, every gesture a weapon. To outsiders, it was the heart of the kingdom, the place where justice and law were born. But to those who walked its echoing halls, it was a pit of vipers, each snake waiting for the moment to sink its fangs into another. The ministers were the first, cloaked in heavy robes, their gold chains rattling like shackles of the kingdom itself. They bent low before the throne, their tongues dripping honey, their hearts dripping venom. They swore loyalty to the master with every breath, but the dwarf, ever watchful from the shadows, saw through the veil. They bribed merchants, skimmed coins from the treasury, sent letters sealed with wax and betrayal. He carried their messages and knew their symbols, the falcon for treachery, the serpent for greed. He knew the promises they made in the dark, trading land for silence, blood for gold. The master trusted them, but the dwarf knew the truth. The throne was not iron, it was paper, and men like these could burn it with a whisper. And then there was the queen. Beautiful, proud, and venomous in her own quiet way. She walked like the crown itself had been carved for her, her gaze cutting through courtiers as though they were dust beneath her feet. To the king, she was a jewel to show off, a trophy adorned with silks and diamonds. But the dwarf saw her when she thought herself unseen, saw the hunger in her eyes when they lingered too long on the crown. She called him the crawling rat whenever her temper burned, yet he knew she despised her husband as much as she despised him. In the quiet hours of the night, he caught her with the Knight of the Guard, their voices sharp with passion and plotting. She wanted more than silk, more than jewels. She wanted a throne, even if it meant carving it out of her husband's corpse. The princes were worse, sons raised in luxury, yet hollow as rotten fruit. One wagered lives in games of dice, peasants and slaves treated as nothing more than tokens in his drunken amusement. Another prince, crueler than his father, set dogs on starving men for sport, their screams echoing into the night while courtiers laughed into their goblets. The dwarf was forced to watch, to fetch wine, to pretend he saw nothing. But in his heart, the memory festered like poison. These were the men who would inherit the kingdom, boys with blades but no honor, wolves raised to believe cruelty was strength. And then there were the courtiers, the endless tide of flatterers, sycophants, and lovers who filled the halls like buzzing flies. Their smiles were wide, their bows deep, but their loyalty was thinner than parchment. They poisoned one another's wine, slipped powders into each other's food, and whispered secrets into whichever ear promised the fattest purse. Once a mistress of the king summoned the dwarf in secret. She pressed a ring into his hand, told him to deliver it to the minister of war with a smile and a lie. He obeyed, never questioning. By dawn, the minister's lips had turned black, his breath stolen by poison hidden in the jewel. The dwarf had not poured the toxin, yet he had carried death in his palm. When the queen discovered it, she laughed. Loyalty is for fools, she told him. Survival is for the clever. Every day he lived among these villains, the dwarf grew sharper, harder, colder. He learned their games not to play them, but to survive them. He knew which minister favored poison, which prince favored knives, which mistress kept a dagger beneath her pillow. He learned which courtiers betrayed for jewels, and which betrayed for love. He learned the truth, that the kingdom was not ruled by kings, but by a court of jackals, each devouring the flesh of the other. And through it all, he remained the shadow in the corner, the toy, the servant, the harmless little man no one feared. They never saw the storm growing behind his eyes. They never understood that while they plotted against one another, they were also teaching him the very art of betrayal. The court was a theater of cruelty. The ministers bled the people dry. The queen wove silken lies. The princes killed for laughter. The lovers poisoned in the dark. Each one a villain, each one a spark feeding the fire inside the dwarf. They thought him nothing, but he was learning everything. Their cruelty gave him the script. Their treachery gave him the tools. And one day, they would give him the stage.